Yeah, so thank you very much for the introduction. Again, my name is Robbie. I'll be serving as the moderator for this debate. So hopefully I won't have too difficult of a job. Both of these gentlemen are very happy to be amiable and friendly, which makes my life a lot easier. So I'm here with the University of Alberta Debate Society, which is the oldest club on campus. We are here to promote open, constructive discourse and improve people's abilities to do so across campus and across Edmonton whenever we can. So, more importantly, the two debaters that we have with us tonight are Randall Rouser on the proposition in support of the existence of God, and against is Justin Schieber. So Randall Rouser received his doctorate from King's College London, and now is a professor of historical theology at the Taylor Seminary College here in Edmonton. He is the author of many books, some of which you can find outside, and one of which is going to be released within the next 2 months. If you're interested in the materials that he's written, you can check out his website, randallrouser.com. There's also, on the opposition, Justin Schieber, who is the co-host of Reasonable Doubt's radio show and a part of the board of the Michigan Center for Inquiry. He supports a friendly and firm skepticism, frequenting debates across North America, including being on the same side last year at the debate that was hosted then. So, to give you an idea of where this debate is going to be going, we are first going to have two 20-minute opening statements, so one from Randall first, and then the next from Justin. They will then have the opportunity to do a 10-minute rebuttal towards the other's arguments, followed by a 15-minute back-and-forth session between the two of them, where they can ask and answer questions to one another. At the end, there's going to be 5 minutes of closing statements from both of them, followed by a 30 or 15-minute question and answer period where members of the audience can ask questions. So, hopefully that gives you an idea of where you're going, and you're all very excited to see this fantastic debate happen once again. So, I would now like to invite Randall Rouser to begin his opening statements in defense of the existence of God.
As good as my timer. Well, first I'd like to begin by thanking the Atheists and Agnostics group here at the campus for making this event possible. I'd like to thank Justin, my worthy opponent, or as I prefer to say, dialogue partner. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on such a nice spring-like day. It takes a real desire to know the truth to bring people in when it's this good outside. Okay, in October 2005, Jon Stewart, host of The Daily Show, appeared on CNN's Crossfire, a debate program that regularly opposed a strident conservative opinion against an equally strident liberal opinion, in a no-holds-barred, no-compromise-allowed debate. Stewart proceeded to eviscerate the format of the show, arguing that it encouraged polarization while distorting complicated issues in favor of simplistic sloganeering and partisanship. In my view, debates on God's existence are often carried out in the manner of Crossfire, with theistic and atheistic apologists each aiming to demonstrate the truth of their position while showing their opponents to be not only wrong, but positively irrational. But the reality is that atheism and theism are both intellectually serious, rationally defensible positions, each supplemented with dozens of arguments that have been ably defended by many of history's greatest minds. Thus, whatever our personal opinions on God's existence, my hope is that we can all leave this evening with a deepened sense of the intellectual seriousness and importance of the question, and a renewed commitment to adopt a position of charity and humility toward our intellectual opponents. While I am here as an apologist for dialogue and charity, I'm also here as an apologist for belief in God. So what do I mean when I say God? For the purposes of this debate, I will refer to God as a necessarily existent, non-physical agent who is omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good. My case for God will proceed in 3 steps. I'm going to begin by arguing that rational belief in God does not require evidence, though its rationality can be strengthened or weakened by evidence. Next, I will defend the legitimacy of appealing to God as a philosophical explanation against a common objection. And finally, I will conclude by arguing that God best accounts for the cognitive faculty of moral intuition. So let's begin. Belief in God can be rational apart from evidence. For many atheists and skeptics, the first stumbling block to considering belief in God is the assumption that such belief is irrational or unjustified, that it lacks evidence. The objection assumes that one must have evidence to believe rationally that God exists. But is this true? I will argue to the contrary. One need not have evidence for God to believe rationally that God exists. Before we get there, we first must understand how one forms a rational belief apart from evidence. And that requires us to distinguish between two types of properly basic belief, or two types of belief, properly basic and properly non-basic belief. A properly basic belief is one that is rational without evidence, and if true, it can be known apart from evidence. By contrast, a properly non-basic belief is one that cannot rationally be held without evidence. With those definitions in mind, the objector is claiming that belief in God is always non-basic, such that rational theistic belief always requires evidence. On the contrary, I will argue that belief in God can be produced in conditions which qualify it as properly basic. To be clear, I'm not claiming belief in God is always properly basic, but only that it can be. Let's begin with a belief which is widely considered to be properly basic: belief in a world external to the human mind. Ever since philosopher George Berkeley wrote more than 2 centuries ago, philosophers have recognized that it is possible that that to which we refer as the external world could merely be the product of human consciousness. Or, as the Wachowskis showed us more recently, we could be brains and or bodies in a matrix. In short, there may be no physical world corresponding to our mental experience. We can call this position world idealism. In contrast, the common sense belief that the external world exists is world realism. Here's the problem. You cannot argue that world idealism is false based on our conscious experience of an external world, since that data is fully consistent with idealism being true. Despite this fact, virtually all people believe there is an external world, and they are certainly rational to do so, even if they cannot show that idealism is false. The reason is because belief in an external world is not based on evidence. It is properly basic. One need not have evidence for it over against its idealist rival in order to believe it rationally. There are many other types of belief that are properly basic as well, including the deliverances of sense perception, moral intuition, more on which I'll talk in my third argument, aesthetic appreciation, rational intuition, memory, proprioception, and testimony. So what is it that makes all these beliefs properly basic? Well, beliefs are not considered properly basic because they are infallible. After all, idealism could be true, there may be no external world. Likewise, sense perception may deceive. We can hallucinate or otherwise misperceive. Other sources of properly basic belief can also lead us astray. Nor are beliefs properly basic because they are held by all rational people. After all, there are rational people who are idealists. There are skeptics of sense perception, and so on. Instead, a properly basic belief is rooted in the naturalness and immediacy by which these beliefs are formed. As one experiences the sensory flux that one calls the world, one finds oneself believing that conscious experience maps a world external to one's mind. So can belief about God be properly basic with the kind of naturalness and immediacy that would qualify it as properly basic in parallel to belief about the external world? I think so. As in other cases, we can answer this question empirically. Are there instances where individuals report belief in God forming with this kind of naturalness and immediacy? Let me give you an example. In 1974, Canadian rock legend Burton Cummings walked into St. Thomas Church in New York. Though he was not a religious man, he was immediately struck by an overwhelming spiritual presence. He wrote about this unsettling experience in his chart-topping 1975 hit, I'm Scared, which includes the following lyric that I will now sing. Something in the air was oh so rare. I don't know what it was, but I know that it's still right there. Yeah, don't put my day job on that. Burton's believed that there was a spiritual presence in the church, what Rudolf Otto famously called the mysterium tremendum, was not an inference from additional data. He didn't reason to it. Rather, it was a natural and immediate experience occasioned upon his entry to the church. Just as he immediately sensed the musty smell and the dim lighting, so he sensed the overwhelming spiritual presence. And as a non-religious agnostic, it took Burton completely by surprise. Burton is not alone. Millions of people have formed belief about God with the same naturalness and immediacy, the same phenomenology of self-presentation that Burton Cummings experienced. And this parallels the naturalness and immediacy with which we form beliefs about the external world, sense perception, and so on. Thus, if the deliverances of these other beliefs can be prima facie properly basic, even when there are alternative explanations of the relevant data, the same applies to belief about God. In short, one can have rational belief in God apart from evidence. Number 2, God is a viable philosophical explanation. My first argument may be sufficient to establish the rationality of belief in God for those who have particular experiences. But what about people who lack experiences and are looking for belief based on evidence? Well, before we consider one line of evidence, I need to take a detour to address a common objection to the legitimacy of appealing evidentially to God. It is important to address this objection at the outset because there is little benefit in launching into arguments for God when many people reject on principle the propriety of appealing to God in the first place. Today, the theist commonly encounters among self-described skeptics and atheists a widespread incredulity toward the concept of God, one that is often symbolized in the flying spaghetti monster. What started out in 2005 as a clever, if somewhat overwrought, satire on intelligent design theory has now morphed into a general cultural zeitgeist of incredulity toward God and religion. Whatever the satirical value of the flying spaghetti monster, that arbitrary gerrymandered concept bears no relation to the concept of God as it is deployed in academic philosophy, a concept which has precise and logically integrated definitional boundaries and which is only invoked when the evidence is seen to require it. But if popular dismissal of God by comparison with a plate of celestial spaghetti misses the mark, there is a more serious objection lying in the background. This is how atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel presents the objection. He says, the idea of God serves as a placeholder for an explanation where something seems to demand explanation and none is available. In other words, far from being a legitimate explanation, Nagel claims that God is what people say when they lack an explanation. It would seem that on Nagel's view, explanatory appeals to deity are ruled out in principle. But Nagel's attempt to exclude God categorically as non-explanatory is simply wrong. To see why, we need to unpack two aspects of the concept of God, namely transcendence and agent causation. To begin with, God is a transcendent explanation. For our purposes, we can define a transcendent explanation as an explanation that seeks to account for the spatio-temporal world or some aspect of the spatio-temporal world by positing an ontological reality that is independent of this world. Academic philosophy is replete with transcendent explanations jostling for supremacy, from abstract objects to objective moral facts to David Lewis's nominalist theory of possible worlds. So Nagel can hardly object on principle to appeals to transcendent concepts, since that would bring him perilously close to rejecting philosophy altogether. One suspects that the real ground of Nagel's objection relates to the second part, agency. In other words, Nagel is okay with transcendent concepts just so long as they are not personal. But why think that transcendent agent causes are non-explanatory? After all, a non-transcendent agent cause can provide an excellent explanation. For example, you're sitting at home watching TV when the light goes on in the next room. There are many possible explanations for this event, but surely among the more likely is that a person turned on the light. If we readily acknowledge the explanatory value of non-transcendent agent causes, what basis is there to deny in principle the explanatory value of transcendent agent causes? Frankly, it seems to me that Nagel's attempt to exclude explanatory termination in transcendent agents is nothing more than a philosophical prejudice, an attempt to exclude a particular type of metaphysical explanation a priori. In conclusion, God is a philosophically serious and legitimate explanatory concept. With that in mind, we can now consider our one test case to demonstrate how God can be proposed for belief based on some feature in the world. Our example will focus on moral intuition. The 19th century Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy recalls the one time he witnessed a public beheading. He writes, "When I saw the head divided from the body and heard the sound with which it fell separately into the box, I understood, not with my reason, but with my whole being, that no theory of the wisdom of all established things, nor of progress, could justify such an act. and that if all the men in the world from the day of creation, by whatever theory, had found this thing necessary, it was not so. It was a bad thing. Therefore, I must judge of what was right and necessary, not by what men said and did, not by progress, but by what I felt to be true in my heart. Note that Tolstoy did not reason discursively by way of a series of premises to the conclusion that public executions are immoral. Rather, witnessing the execution provided the occasion for him to form the properly basic belief in his heart, as he says, that public executions are wrong. Tolstoy's experience points us to the existence of a moral cognitive faculty, one that is commonly called moral intuition, sometimes called conscience, which produces beliefs about the moral dimensions of persons, acts, and states of affairs, including good and evil, rightness and wrongness, as surely as sense perception produces beliefs about the physical dimensions and sensic qualities of physical things. In the same way that a radio has the ability to tune in to FM radio waves, so properly functioning human beings are equipped with a sort of moral radio, by which we can tune into basic moral properties about persons, acts, and states of affairs. This moral perception enables us to perceive in a non-discursive way, that is apart from reasoning, moral goods and evils, rights and wrongs. But where do we get this moral radio? What process equipped us with such an extraordinary faculty, an insight into a non-physical moral realm? The great atheist Bertrand Russell recognized the problem when he wrote, "A strange mystery it is that nature, omnipotent but blind in the revolutions of her secular hurryings through the abysses of space, has brought forth at last a child, subject still to her power, but gifted with sight, with knowledge of good and evil, with the capacity of judging all the works of its unthinking mother." In a similar manner, Richard Rorty points out how the existence of truth-directed cognitive faculties, and moral intuition in particular, contradict a purely survival-driven pressure that is proposed by an atheistic form of Darwinian evolution. He writes, "The idea that one species of organism is unlike all the others, oriented not just toward its own increated prosperity, but toward truth, is as un-Darwinian as the idea that every human being has a built-in moral compass, a conscience that swings free of both social history and individual luck." Well, this is indeed a problem for atheism. So how might an atheist attempt to explain the origin and nature of this moral compass? One alternative is to attempt to demystify the deliverances of moral intuition by deconstructing moral properties. One could try to do so by claiming that the data of moral intuition is socially constructed. That is, human beings as individuals or groups create good and evil, right and wrong. More radically, one could take the view that moral intuition doesn't provide factual information at all, but instead merely produces non-cognitive emotional reactions to stimuli. Unfortunately, ethical reductionism of these types exacts a high cost, for it obliges a person to deny that moral intuition provides us with objectively factual information when assessing morally horrific acts like ISIS public beheadings, or morally heroic acts like doctors risking their lives to fight Ebola. Another option for the atheist is to adopt a Platonic moral realism, according to which acts are good or evil in virtue of exemplifying or failing to exemplify an abstract Platonic goodness. While this position has the advantage of retaining the objective facticity of the deliverances of moral intuition, it leaves the cognitive faculty more mysterious than ever. How does moral intuition intuit this timeless, inert, abstract goodness? In sum, moral intuition presents a true mystery for the atheist. I suspect the only reason we do not find moral intuition more extraordinary is because its deliverances are so immediate and natural to us. Natural though they may be, on atheism they also remain truly extraordinary. While moral intuition is fundamentally perplexing on atheism, it is perfectly sensible if we believe in God, an omnipotent and morally perfect agent who, as such, has both the ability and motivation to equip his rational agents with the capacity to grasp moral facts, no less than facts about the physical world. Thus, if we intuit moral facts about the world because God designed us to do so on the desire that we have moral knowledge. Just as a person provides the best explanation of the light switching on in the room, so a person provides the best explanation of that moral light of conscience by which we grasp moral facts. Had we several more hours, we could proceed to build a cumulative case for God's existence by adding additional arguments to the one presented here. Within the moral sphere alone, there are many arguments. God has been invoked as an explanation for the origin of moral value, Thomas Aquinas. Moral obligation, Robert Adams, C. Stephen Evans. The satisfaction of justice, Immanuel Kant. The moral gap, John Hare. And human dignity, Nicholas Wolterstorff. Beyond the moral sphere, God has been invoked to explain dozens of other phenomena, some of which I've discussed in my 2 apologetics books. Suffice it to say, the argument presented here is but the modest tip of a very large iceberg. To conclude, in this presentation, I've argued that a person can rationally believe in God apart from evidence. Next, I defended the status of God as a legitimate explanation against 2 common objections. Finally, I concluded by arguing that God best explains the cognitive faculty of moral intuition. I presented this as one sample argument among dozens that could be given. Well, if you came to this evening hoping for an exchange reminiscent of Crossfire, then I hope you're not too disappointed. But the reality is that academic philosophy has little patience with the petty triumphalism and quick and neat answers that frequently characterize apologetic debates on God's existence. In other words, I'm not here to argue anybody into believing in God, but simply to point evidence for the rationality of that belief. If you did experience some disappointment, I hope your parting emotion is instead a deepened appreciation for the intellectual seriousness and importance of the question of God, and a renewed commitment to extend charity and adopt intellectual humility toward those with whom you disagree. If I've accomplished that much, I shall consider this evening a success.
Thank you, Randall, for that stirring opening address. And we would now like to invite Justin to continue the case, or to open the case against the existence of God. Can you hear me? All right, let me get my slide cue here. Okay. Well, so apparently Randall and I are going to be doing some karaoke afterwards, so I look forward to that. Well, good evening. I want to begin by thanking Jorgo Van Veenhuizen and Alexander Delorme and the University of Alberta Atheists and Agnostics for their inviting me to participate in tonight's debate. And I also want to thank my opponent and friend, Randall Rouser, for agreeing to participate. And last but not least, I of course want to thank all of you for coming out. Now, you've already been given the definition of theism that Mr. Rouser wishes to defend. This is essentially classical standard theism. Now, I take it that it is my turn then to say a little bit about what I'll be defending tonight. I am an atheist in the sense that I think standard theism is false. And the atheistic hypothesis I'll be defending tonight is called metaphysical naturalism. So what is naturalism? Well, without getting too detailed, naturalism, at least as I view it, asserts that the natural world is a causally closed system. And this entails that there are no outside or supernatural agents capable of creating or otherwise interacting within the natural world. And if naturalism is true, then atheism is also true. And tonight, my goals are twofold. Tonight my goals are twofold. First, I will argue that naturalism is a simpler hypothesis than theism. And secondly, I will argue that naturalism is a more accurate hypothesis than theism. That is to say that it better fits the evidence that we have. First things first. Why is naturalism a simpler hypothesis than theism? Well, I agree with philosopher Paul Draper when he argues that naturalism and supernaturalism are, at least prior to the evidence, roughly equivalent hypotheses in simplicity. But we're not debating naturalism versus supernaturalism tonight. Rather, we are debating naturalism
and a very specific form of supernaturalism, mainly the form that rather ambitiously takes on board a plethora of additional assertions about an all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect God. We're debating theistic supernaturalism. And theistic supernaturalism is significantly more complex and less simple than basic supernaturalism. And so compared to theistic supernaturalism, or theism for short, naturalism is a simple hypothesis. And philosophers generally agree that all else being equal, you should prefer the simple hypothesis. And so this is a good pre-evidential reason to prefer my naturalistic hypothesis over my opponent's theistic hypothesis. However, another indispensable part of comparing hypotheses is to evaluate their explanatory power, to evaluate them according to their evidential fit or accuracy. Philosopher of science at Johns Hopkins University, Victor DeFate, writes, quote, "The most widely accepted probabilistic account of evidence is the so-called increase in probability or positive relevance account." And so the idea here is simply that E is evidence for H if and only if E makes H more probable than it otherwise would have been. And so, particularly good evidence for naturalism and against theism will be observations that are very much to be expected on the assumption that naturalism is true, but rather surprising on the assumption that theism is true. And I want to bring our attention to three observations that fit this description and so count as evidence for naturalism and against theism. And there are, of course, other observations, but I will limit myself to these three. And to be clear, none of these evidences will conclusively prove that theism is false, just as none of my opponent's arguments can conclusively prove that theism is true. Rather, what we are doing is we are building our respective evidential cases, and your role tonight is to decide who, in your opinion, has built the stronger case. So then, what is my evidence for naturalism? Well, the fact that we are even having this debate presupposes a few things. It presupposes that it's possible for intelligent and fair-minded individuals to disagree about the existence of God. It's quite clear that there are many people who do not believe in God, and I count myself among them. Equally clear, however, is that many of these non-believers are not resisting theism. Rather, some just find that the evidence for theism is poor. Or perhaps they find that after considering the total evidence, both for and against theism, that the evidence is ambiguous. It doesn't really point obviously in one way or the other. So there's no real clear winner. Still, others are just completely unaware of the very concept of God. And so there's plenty of genuine and rational non-belief in the world that is in no way the fault of the non-believers. All that is to say is that if God exists, He has not made His existence sufficiently clear to satisfy even those who very much wish He was real. And it is this fact about non-resistant non-believers which will serve as my first point of evidence, represented by H here. That there's plenty of non-belief in the world instantiated by doubt or disbelief or by ignorance of the necessary concepts. That is not, again, the fault of the non-believers. Premise 1. H is highly unlikely on the assumption that theism is true. On theism, we would expect that a perfectly loving God would want a meaningful, conscious relationship with the creatures whom He loved. And so for this reason, God would ensure that all such creatures, so long as they were not resistant to Him, believed that He existed. Why? Well, because only then would these persons then be in a position to freely respond to God and enter into a meaningful relationship with God. So on theism, the fact that there are unbelievers who are not resisting God in any way is very unlikely. Premise 2, H is highly likely if naturalism is true. If naturalism is true, of course, this is not at all surprising. Indeed, the poverty of theistic arguments is entirely expected on naturalism because God does not exist. Therefore, H strongly supports naturalism over theism. And very often, theists of the Christian persuasion will simply say, but Justin, there are no non-resistant unbelievers. They all resist God in their own righteousness. These persons are usually quick with a biblical verse to back up their point. However, this kind of arrogance of biblical proportions fails to be anything other than assuming the thing to be true that's actually being challenged, and therefore constitutes a textbook example of question begging. And to his credit, Randall Rouser takes a quite different and much more interesting approach to dealing with the hiddenness argument, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But for now, I'd like to move on to my second bit of evidence for naturalism against theism. This is a picture taken in 1990 from the Voyager 1 space probe. It was taken 3.7 billion miles from Earth. Now, if you look closely, you'll see a pale little blue dot. That's Earth. Now, even this picture only captures but a speck of the observable universe, which we, by the way, know is expanding. In other words, the scale of the universe is absolutely incredible. Let me be clear. I agree with my opponent, Randall Rouser, who's written elsewhere actually, that the scale of the universe is of little relevance to the existence of God. However, I think that the fact that the vast majority of this universe is completely hostile to life clearly is relevant to the existence of God, with extreme heat, extreme cold, radiation, the fact that most planetary orbits are unstable, comets, asteroids. It's hard to come away with any conclusion other than that this generally, as a whole, universe seems quite like a death trap. Now notice that this fact, when combined with the already mentioned fact about the incredible size of the universe, suddenly makes our fact about the inherent hostility of the universe even more surprising on theism. Now, not only is it the case that the vast majority of the universe is completely hostile to life, but now we see that the ratio between the friendly parts of the universe and the unfriendly parts of the universe is disturbingly large. Premise 1, hostility of the vast majority of our universe, and the scale of our universe, represented on the slide as HS, hostility and scale, is highly unlikely on the assumption that theism is true. If theism is true, and God has created the universe for us, then it is a strange and awkward fact why our massive universe should appear to be almost entirely designed to kill the very beings for which it was created to sustain. But let me be clear, God certainly could have created it that way. But of course, he could have created it a million other ways, which would not have automatically killed us simply for venturing from our pale blue dot. This fact about the near universal hostility of our massive universe is quite an awkward fit on theism. Premise 2, the hostility to life in the vast majority of the universe and our scale of the universe is not very surprising on naturalism, is rather likely. Again, if naturalism is true, this isn't at all surprising because life isn't special in the universe. We shouldn't expect the universe to care about keeping us safe any more than it should care about keeping a particular comet on course. Conclusion, therefore, the hostility to life of the vast majority of the universe, combined with the scale of the universe, strongly supports naturalism over theism. And most of you may be familiar with the logical problem of evil. This is an argument attempt to demonstrate that there's a logical contradiction between the existence of God and any evil or suffering in the world. However, I want to give God a little bit of a break here. After all, we do have a little bit of a history. I'm perfectly willing to grant that God may have reasons for allowing certain instances of suffering to occur in the actual world. After all, it seems plausible to me that if God exists, God may have some reasons to allow suffering, perhaps to ensure some greater good, or to avoid some equally bad or worse instance of suffering. However, if God existed, he would not allow an instance of suffering unless it was logically necessary for, to obtain some greater good or to avoid some equally bad or worse instance of suffering. But, of course, now we get to the problem. Many instances of suffering that we see in our world by both human and non-human animals seem suspiciously like the exact kinds of suffering that a perfectly loving being would prevent if such a being did exist. They seem utterly pointless. Think of the Holocaust. Think of the slavery of the American South. Think of ISIS. Now, the usual response to this is to argue that God gave us free will, and our abuse of that free will is just that. It's an abuse. Now, I agree that free will is important. Generally speaking, people should be allowed to make their mistakes, learn, and grow accordingly. However, though, However important free will is, we must recognize that it is not a trump card. Everybody in this room already knows this. Imagine you're walking down the street and you witness an elderly couple just being beaten within an inch of their lives so that the attacker can score a gold watch, right? Are we not morally obligated to help if we are able? Of course we are. If respecting the attacker's free will is not an adequate justification for our simply walking by and allowing this crime to happen, then why should we suggest that this kind of justification could work for the existence of God? And then, of course, we have natural suffering. Think of the central theory of biology, the theory of evolution by natural selection. It can only occur with massive amounts of suffering and death, most of which occurred long before humans entered the world stage. And notice that this is not just an accidental byproduct of evolution. The suffering and death within natural selection is intrinsic to the system. Also in the category of natural suffering is earthquakes, tornadoes, droughts, floods, famine, disease. This is all very real and deeply felt suffering. We must admit that this seemingly massive amount of seemingly pointless suffering is very unlikely on the assumption that theism is true. But of course, if naturalism is true, then there's really no problem in fitting these facts into the naturalistic worldview. Because naturalism, unnaturalism, the universe does not care about our well-being, it's blind to it. And so the massive amounts of seemingly pointless suffering in the world strongly favor naturalism over theism. Or in other words, as a philosopher once wrote, suffering counts against the existence of God in the same way that crabgrass on the golf green counts against the existence of an efficient greenskeeper. Now you may be thinking, but Justin, God is mysterious. He may have reasons beyond your understanding for allowing these tragedies. Well, that of course may be true, but that does little to undermine my evidential argument, because it may also be that God is mysterious and he may have extra reasons for preventing these tragedies that we observe. And so without a reason to think that one set of unknowns is bigger than the other set of unknowns, this point is of little importance to my evidential argument. Okay, something happened on my thing here. So in review, the hiddenness of God, I argue, is evidence for naturalism and against theism. The hostility to life of the vast majority of our massive universe also counts as evidence for naturalism and against theism, and the massive amounts of seemingly pointless suffering also count as evidence for naturalism and against theism. And one might argue that, well, sure, isn't it at least possible that you could still believe in the existence of God with this evidence? And of course it's possible. You could always say, well, look, you can explain suffering through a kind of unknown reason, right? But again, if we don't have antecedent reasons for supposing that the unknowns which justify those sufferings are bigger than the unknowns which add to the problems of the suffering, then appealing to this doesn't do much. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin, for that wonderful opening to the argument against the existence of God. We are next going to move into the series of rebuttals between the two speakers. So first we will give Randall a 10-minute opportunity to deal with the arguments that were presented by Justin, and then Justin will have the same opportunity back towards Randall. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite Randall to continue the argument in favor of God. Hear, hear.
I'd like to thank Justin for a stimulating opening salvo. Let's see what I can say in response to it. So he had three arguments there. And I want us to keep in mind that he's not simply arguing for agnosticism. He's not simply arguing that the evidence is indeterminate. Rather, he's arguing that he's establishing that the probabilities he's presenting are so strong that one should in fact become an atheist and have that conviction. So I'll work through his arguments. I think I'll begin with the hostility and size of the universe with emphasis on hostility. So just in here, and I should say this, in each one of these arguments, I will be challenging the first premise, that God is unlikely given X. So on this one, the first premise is that the hostility to life in the universe is unlikely on the assumption that theism is true. And I would challenge that assumption. I think what is in fact being slipped in the back door is not just theism, but theism along with anthropocentrism. So the idea that somehow this universe should have been designed precisely with human beings in mind and should provide a maximal place for us to stretch our legs. And if we're not talking about anthropocentrism here, we're simply talking about theism. So even from the outset, I don't find that that first argument really is getting at what we are specifically debating. But that said, I want to say a little bit more here. So imagine that you have an architect and they're going to produce their master work. Are we going to expect that if they're like the best architect ever, that of course the one thing they're going to build as their master work is going to be a small, cozy little home? Probably not. We'll probably expect they would make something rather grand with broad marble staircases and big balconies and vaulted ceilings, and also with little nooks and little alcoves and nice little areas as well. Similarly, when we think, to the extent where our intuitions are at all reliable as to what kind of universe would a divine being create, I think we can get, first of all, some guidance from what classical theists have said about God. They said two different things. First of all, that God is transcendent. I already referred to that concept, but in terms of theology, that God utterly goes beyond the universe. God is infinite. In fact, one of the classic attributes of God is immensity, to refer to God as being immense. The other is immanence. God is present in the small details. And in fact, I think that that's what we find in the universe. On the one hand, it is a grand, awesome, severe, majestic universe, but also in that pale blue dot from that image, Carl Sagan's famous image from 1990, it's also intimate, it's also small, it's also immanent. So in fact, I think the universe is, to the extent where I have any reliable intuitions on this, pretty much what I would expect if God were to have made it. Let me turn to pointless suffering. So again, on this, I'm going to challenge the first premise, that apparently pointless suffering is highly unlikely on the assumption that theism is true. Let me begin by giving you an illustration. So imagine that you are beginning an apprenticeship with a master craftsman, which is going to last for many years. And so for the next several years, you're going to be shadowing this individual and doing everything they do and following them to try to learn this craft. Would you expect that on the first day, they might be asking you to do things that didn't seem to make a lot of sense? That they might be doing things that didn't seem to make a lot of sense, that seemed to be arbitrary and to lack purpose? I think that would be expected, precisely because of your lack of knowledge, your great lack of knowledge compared to this person that you are mentoring under. I think here of the 1984 high watermark in 1980s culture, the film Karate Kid. Anybody remember that film? Okay. I know there's a remake, but I'm talking about the original. So in the original, Daniel is getting beat up at school, and so he goes to Mr. Miyagi, and he wants to be taught karate. The first thing Mr. Miyagi does is he asks him, go out and polish all my cars. And so he's doing the wax on, wax off. And he says, go paint my fence. And he's painting his fence. And he's getting really irritated because everything seems to be pointless. Nothing seems to have any point. And he's beginning to think maybe even he's just getting exploited. But ultimately in the film, it is shown that everything that Mr. Miyagi allows Daniel to do, everything that happens to Daniel, is all for a greater purpose. Although Daniel couldn't appreciate it at the time. It's not surprising, I would think, that with an infinite God running the universe, there would be things that likewise would appear to us to be pointless. So how do we deal with the problem of evil in particular? Well, this is, of course, an extraordinarily difficult issue. But the way we deal with it, I think, is certainly not in a 10-minute rebuttal. So the most thing I can say here is something that Danish writer Karen Blixen said. She said, all sorrow can be born if you tell a story about it. What she's saying there is, when something terrible happens in the world, you can just look at it and it doesn't seem to make any sense to you. Like, what's the point of that? Why would that happen? Maybe there is no point. But what we need to do is embed that event within a wider, broader narrative, going back, going forward, and into the network of relations around it. And only then can you be in an epistemic position to, in terms of knowledge position, to make a reasonable conclusion about whether this really is indeed a pointless event. The philosopher Eleanor Stump makes this point in her 600-page book, Wandering in Darkness, which is all about the problem of evil from a philosopher's perspective. She says, okay, imagine that you have some Martians, and their only window onto planet Earth is looking into a hospital. They don't see anything outside of a hospital. They would probably conclude after a while that there are a lot of pointless, horrific things going on. The point, however, that Stump makes is for them to have an evidenced conclusion that can lead to knowledge, to support that conclusion, they would have to know what's going on outside the hospital. They would have to know the events prior to people coming into the hospital that led them to be there, and they would have to know what's going to happen to those individuals after leaving the hospital. And it's only when you embed these events in a wider narrative that we can be in a position to make the kinds of judgments, that probabilistic judgments that Justin wants to make. So let me come now to the point on non-resistant non-believers. Here Justin says non-resistant non-believers are highly unlikely on the assumption that theism is true. Well, some Christians, and certainly I think in academic philosophy, a minority of Christians, from what I've seen, deny that there are such things as non-resistant non-believers. Others, and myself included, recognize that at least some people certainly seem to be non-resistant non-believers. In fact, in my book, Is the Atheist My Neighbor, which is coming out in about 2 months, that's one of the things I'll be talking about there. So I agree that there are such people. The question is, what do we infer from the fact? Well, I think one of the assumptions Justin makes is he says belief in God, and I can't begin to address the whole issue here, I'll do just a little bit of it. But he says that belief in God is required for meaningful relationship with God. And that is a dubious assumption. It's certainly not one that any theist is obliged to accept. Think about it, first of all, with our entry into the world. Our most fundamental formative relationships with our parents begin as non-linguistic, non-cognitive relationships between infant and parent. So from that point, that is a meaningful relationship, but it is one that is non-cognitive. What about people who are linguistic, who have mental capacity, a properly functioning adult, who does not believe in God and introspects and says, it seems like I want to know if there's a God, but there just doesn't seem to be one. Well, one thing we can say here is, again, talking about theism, there are many theists who believe such individuals also can have meaningful relationships with God. So the Catholic Church, since Vatican II in the 1960s, has believed there could be people who are called anonymous Christians. And that means that there could be people who are in relationship with God in some way, even though they don't conceptually have the right beliefs about God. C.S. Lewis talks about something similar at the end of the Chronicles of Narnia in The Last Battle. Throughout the Chronicles of Narnia, there is an evil character, this divine figure named Tash. And in the last book, one individual who had been giving obeisance to Tash now encounters Aslan, who's the true God. And Aslan says to this person, all the service thou hast done to Tash, I accept as service done to me. No service which is vile can be done to me, and none which is not vile can be done to him. What happens at the end of the book there is this individual realizes he had been in a meaningful relationship with Aslan without having known it. And it is certainly open to the theist to recognize that in cases of people who are non-resistant non-believers, they may be, to some degree, in a meaningful relationship with God. What that looks like is perhaps a question for later or another day. But to say the least, I don't think we're in a position to draw a skeptical conclusion based on this evidence.
All right. Thank you very much, Randall, for that rebuttal. And we would now like to invite Justin to serve his rebuttal. Here.
Okay, in his opening, Randall Rouser presents us with three arguments to consider. The first argument was an argument for the rationality of theistic belief in the absence of evidence. Following the philosopher Albert Plantinga, he argues that theistic belief is warranted in a similar way that belief in the external world or belief in other minds might be warranted. These are things which appear to have no good arguments for them, but nevertheless, we are still within our epistemic rights to hold these beliefs. This is because we consider these beliefs properly basic, and belief in God, it is being argued, is similarly situated. But is it that easy? I don't think so. I think that one problem is that you could ask yourself, is there any criterion that a belief needs to meet in order that it might rightly be considered properly basic? Or are all possible beliefs on the table to be justified in this way? What I'm suggesting is that this view works too well. For example, this method works equally as a justification for belief in Islam or any other promiscuous belief system, so long as its adherents have a sufficiently advanced imagination such that they can paint a story in which their cognitive processes, according to that story, are reliable. What's to stop people from using the same reasoning to justify belief in fairies, for example? When challenged, they could always retreat to metaphysics and say that there exists some fairy godmother that, through some yet-to-be-understood magical process, ensures that our belief-forming mechanisms in the brain are generally oriented toward true belief. Now, I'm not arguing that belief in God is like belief in fairies. However, I am arguing that the justificatory story that we are being told by Randall is disturbingly similar. There's very little on Randall's view here in his first argument that it couldn't justify. It's hard to see something so permissive as being something that should be taken particularly seriously. Its only limits, again, seem to be the metaphysical imaginations of its adherents. I want to argue that there's a difference, though, between belief in God and belief in the physical world or belief in other minds. And the difference I want to offer is that belief in God, unlike belief in the physical world or in the external world or belief in other minds, it does not enjoy universal sanction. This is an idea put forth by actually a Christian philosopher, James Sennett. And it's a great way to think about what kinds of belief can be properly considered properly basic. Now, what do we mean by universal sanction? Well, there's three prongs. First, that beliefs of the kind are, under normal circumstances, accepted by nearly all thinkers. Secondly, that thinkers directly form beliefs of this kind as a matter of normal living. And third, that the denial of beliefs of this kind is unthinkable. It would lead to a global skepticism or something to that effect. Now, notice that the belief in other minds in the external world meet these criteria. How then does a belief in God fare on this criteria? Well, it's not obvious that a belief in God can pass any of these three prongs. And so it's relevantly different. It's a relevantly different kind of belief than the other two. And so if Randall wants to argue that belief in God can be similarly justified as belief in the external world or belief in other minds is justified, I think he needs to give a more plausible set of criterion by which to preserve these three things as being properly basic, while also eliminating other wild imaginative stories. He needs some kind of constraint on this view. Randall's second argument is an argument against the view that God is in principle unable to serve as an explanatory hypothesis. And I have no argument against this. I think he's absolutely right on this. I think that popular memes like the flying spaghetti monster are quite frankly, an embarrassment. So far, we have discussed two of Randall's arguments, though. The first of which, if successful, shows that if theism is true, then theistic belief is warranted. The second is a defense of the ability for theism to play as an explanatory hypothesis. However, neither of these arguments give us any reason to think that theism actually is true. And in a debate about the existence of God, presumably we are primarily interested in that question. Luckily, Randall's third argument does begin to address this question. Randall's third argument is not an argument about moral ontology. Rather, it's an argument about moral epistemology. And that is to say that it's not an argument about it's not an argument which appeals to the fact that moral facts indeed exist. Rather, it's an argument which appeals to the fact that we can gain some kind of knowledge of these moral facts. And we're told that this has a rather awkward fit on naturalism and a rather comfortable fit on theism. Now, one view, which is compatible with atheism, is the view that moral facts can be grasped by intuition. An ethical intuition is an intuition whose content is an evaluative statement. So things like murder is bad or charity is good. And we may not know exactly how this intuition connects with moral facts, but the fact that murder is bad seems so obvious, it means this intuition is prima facie justified. And this is not to say that all intuitions are equally justified, or even that it would of course be important to realize that we can be wrong about these things, and it's important to be open to revising our views on this. Perhaps intuitions about morality play or operate similarly as intuitions about logic. Often, when faced with simple, invalid arguments, most people will be able to recognize that it's invalid, even if they're not able to articulate why it's invalid. And the same goes for grammar. People can read a sentence and recognize that something is wrong about it, but they can't particularly articulate why it's wrong. And perhaps moral intuition works like that. Another objection to Randall's third argument here on moral intuition is perhaps best phrased as a question. Why would God, who is primarily interested in deep relationship with and the moral maturity of his created creatures, why would he allow such extreme moral disagreement to persist among his created creatures? We can find theists of all stripes, on all sides, of every controversial moral issue. And that seems quite a surprise if God particularly cares about a loving relationship with his creatures and cares about their moral maturity. You would expect them to have much more of an agreement on some of the, at least the more extreme moral issues that we deal with. And so the question is, does theism have explanatory resources to explain such a hands-off approach that God, if he exists, quite clearly takes in regard to extreme and sometimes violent moral disagreement of his followers? Well, I don't think it does. On naturalism, our knowledge of facts can be an error, and there's no one really to guarantee that our knowledge of moral facts is correct. And so moral disagreement, even significant moral disagreement, is not at all that surprising on naturalism. How much time do I have left? 2 minutes, okay. I want to now turn to some of the criticisms that Randall gave of my arguments. And so, if you recall, one of my arguments was that the hostility of the universe in conjunction with the fact that the universe is quite large is surprising on theism. And Randall worries that I'm kind of bringing in an assumption in the back door about how God is anthropocentric of some sort, and he argues that perhaps the universe is so large because it can be seen as a kind of big project that God partook in. And so we would expect it to be a very grand display. And that, I don't find that surprising. I would agree with Randall. I would expect it to be large. But what I'm asking is that doesn't actually explain the hostility of his artwork, right? If, for example, I wanted to create a house, I was an architect and I wanted people to enjoy my rad skills at architecture, I wouldn't make it the case that they can enter the front door and then not go much further than that, right? It would be rather surprising if I were to take another step and fall into a pit of fire or something to that effect, or there was booby traps. I mean, Randall seems to be suggesting that Home Alone 1 is really what God is after. He also worries that, again, against the hiddenness argument, that it might be the case that God has reasons that we don't actually have access to. And the concern I have here is that, sure, it might be that God has reasons beyond our understanding for allowing non-resistant non-believers, but of course God might have extra reasons beyond our understanding for preventing non-resistant non-believers. And unless we have reason to think that one of those sets is bigger than the other, this objection does nothing to my evidential argument. Thank you.
So thank you to both of the speakers for their excellent opening statements and rebuttals. The next part that we're going to go through is to a 15-minute back and forth. So this is as much for your knowledge as for the audience's. And this entire section will take 15 minutes. They will both be able to ask each other questions, answer the question that was asked, and then ask another question in return. And that's how we're going to do this back and forth. So does that sort of make sense? Okay. So the way that this will work is that one of them will ask a question, the other gets to respond, and then ask a question in turn back across the table. Try and keep your questions short, less than 30 seconds, and answers less than 2 or 3 minutes. Kind of as an objective, so that we have an equal exchange that goes on. Does that sound fair? Okay.
Robbie's mic, because my mic was feeding back earlier, and I won't make a move.
Awesome. Can we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of like setting up something and then posing a question?
This is a guideline so that there can be good back and forth.
Yeah.
Trying.
Yeah, sure.
But you can start it.
Okay, so let's begin with, Justin, in response to my epistemological argument, I just feel I need to get a little bit of setup here so people understand what's at play here. So there's 2 different approaches to epistemology. One of them is an approach that's called a particularist approach, where you begin with instances of putative knowledge or rational belief, and then you reason a theory about what rational belief or knowledge is constituted by based upon those instances. The second is a methodist approach, which you've presented here, which is you begin with a method and you try to impose that and say, for anything to count as knowledge, it must meet up to this kind of standard. So this is a pretty basic argument, a disagreement in epistemology. And I guess to come to a question on that, so for example, I take it that you accept moral intuition as having universal sanction. Do you?
I think so.
Yes.
Well, I hope so, because there was just, I'm sorry, Randall, I'm just trying to make sure these don't get feedback here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Check.
Can you hear me? Oh,
Do you want me to kind of move somewhere else or something? Can we further apart?
We could also just pass back and forth.
That could work. All right.
we can do that.
So if you don't, if moral knowledge is not properly basic, if it doesn't provide you a properly basic starting point, then you're not going to end up justifying the vast majority of moral beliefs people have, average people have. So I think you really need to start there. So then the next question is, well, how much universal sanction does there need to be? Because about 2% of the population is clinically psychopathic and are unable to grasp moral facts like the rest of us. So is that sufficient on this argument of moral sanction to provide a defeater for moral beliefs as having this universal sanction?
Right. Well, if you so the 3 set of criterion I was using here with James Sennett, I know you're familiar with this. One of them is that that the thinkers directly form these kinds of beliefs as a matter of normal living, and so I would hardly consider psychopathic individuals and the beliefs they form to meet this prong. And so I don't know that that's particularly relevant to the...
Why would they be relevant? I mean, many psychopaths are CEOs of corporations.
Well, the first prong is under normal circumstances accepted by nearly all thinkers, right? And we're appealing to a minority group, right, which psychopaths would clearly count as, then it would fail to meet what I would consider properly basic. And like this is all, obviously this is all very tentative. I just find this a plausible distinction line between those things which can be properly considered properly basic and those things which I think we were both as concerned with particularly imaginative scenarios. It seems like we need to draw the line somewhere as to what kinds of beliefs we can be rationally justified for holding without evidence. It seems like there needs to be some line, and this seems plausible to me. Maybe perhaps you have a better view.
Well, so I would take, again, I'm a particularist, so I would take the view of 18th century Scottish common sense realist Thomas Reid, where you begin by looking at how people naturally, under normal conditions, form beliefs, and then you use that as starting points for building your epistemology. So, I think that psychopaths do live normally in society. They don't grasp moral facts the same way other people do. So I just find that the criterion you've offered, where there has to be this, most people have to agree, well, how many is most, and who says? It seems to me that there's a lot of problems with the Methodist epistemology you're presenting. And there's also a danger that it's really what you're doing is using your own plausibility structures, what you think is plausible or not, dictate how you're now going to build a method to try to include the things you want to include and exclude the things you want to exclude.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, what do you mean by that? So when I was using these arguments, presumably we can talk about how if we say, independent of some particular argument that we're discussing, we say, okay, we'll level the playing field, we'll say the probability of God, say, is 0.5, right? Then the question is, when we add this new evidence to the table, where does it point the needle? Does it shift, and how much? What direction does it go? And on all those arguments, it seems like you could do something similar. So it doesn't really rely on my background knowledge. I'm talking just about the conceptual output of theism. Does that make sense?
Well, I think we have a deep epistemological disagreement here as to how do you build an epistemology. So, and when I give a concrete example of Burton Cummings, I think somebody, let's say they walk into a building, they're not primed, right? They're not prepared to look for something. Like if you watch a horror movie and then you hear all these strange bumps, you think there's a psychopath in the house or something. It's not like that. You come in with no expectation. You suddenly have this overwhelming sense that there is some spiritual presence there. And this is a well-documented phenomenon that many people have experienced, and Rudolf Otto wrote a famous book on it, The Idea of the Holy. And now it impacts this rock star who's not known for being a deep spiritual thinker. And I don't understand why that couldn't provide prima facie ground for him to believe there's some kind of spiritual being out there. And then you work from there and you build your beliefs.
Well, so I'm not actually arguing against the possibility that perhaps someone's orientations are very much supernaturalistically oriented, and that if they were to then enter a house that gave them weird feelings, that they might interpret it that way, and that might be rational because given their prior probabilities, it would, it's not crazily unexpected to them, so to them it's not rational. I don't have necessarily a problem with that.
So you do concede that you could rationally form a properly basic belief in God under certain conditions?
I wouldn't think of that as properly basic. I would think of that, we're talking about...
You said it's rational, so...
Well, the story you just unpacked there had to do with how this new, this experience would adjust their possibility of theism. That to me, are we talking about proper basicality, or are we talking about evidential effects? You know what I mean? Those are two different questions.
Well, what I'm saying, you can have a rational belief, it could be a properly basic belief, it could qualify for that. And if it's true, it could also constitute knowledge.
I think that I make room for proper basic beliefs. I just don't think God is a good candidate there. But I'm not saying, I depart with a lot of my atheistic friends. I do think that theism in certain contexts can be rational.
You want to ask something?
Yeah, I was interested in... Okay, so on the hiddenness argument, it was interesting. I had not heard the reply that you used, that you said that belief in God is not necessary for significant relationship with God. And in the argument, I used conscious relationship, right? I'm using Schellenberg's terminology here. And I guess I'm wondering, you kind of referenced the kind of relationship that a precognitive child would have with its mother. That seems to me like the most trivial kind of relationship. How would that be something? That's just a I mean, that's trivial. There's no conditions that are necessary for that kind of thing.
Okay, well, that example was given to provide a defeater for the claim that meaningful relationship is always constituted by propositional assent to certain claims. But I did go on, and I gave other examples. I know that the Catholic Church and C.S. Lewis both laid out a theological framework in which, and we're not talking about Christianity, we're just talking about theism here, but even within mainstream Christianity, they would recognize people can have some kind of meaningful relationship with God even apart from cognitive propositional belief about God.
Yeah, I guess I'm skeptical. Like, what do you mean by meaningful? Like, if you're talking about a person who, you know, I mean, I presume you mean something where someone is you know, they're aware of moral facts and they moderate their behavior toward them, and that is in some sense a relationship with God. But it seems like the most trivial kind of relationship. Like, it's the lowest bar of a connection, right? Because they don't even think that this entity exists. So I don't see how there's, like, I think I'm suspicious of your word meaningful, of your use of the word meaningful there. I guess could you unpack that?
Okay, so here's one scenario, and so you could have somebody, let's say that they're an atheist, and they're an atheist because they worked in the Congo and they've been working for years with victims of war rape, and that has destroyed any belief they otherwise had in God. But they remain committed to fighting for justice, to fighting for mercy, to see these people find redemption and wholeness again. Now, there are versions of Christianity and certainly versions of theism simpliciter, which would interpret potentially what those people are doing right now is by seeking justice, by seeking mercy, by seeking goodness in the world, they are in fact, de facto, seeking God even though they don't know it. And they're in a relationship with God even though they don't know it. You could think perhaps analogously, if a person can drink water and never know that they're drinking H2O. A person could be seeking justice in the world in a profound, meaningful way, not in a trivial way, and they could be in relationship with God in some way in virtue of doing that. And there's even a way to interpret, for example, what Jesus says in Matthew 25 about the sheep and the goats along these lines, where he says to people, "You, as much as you did it for the least of these my brothers, you did it unto me." And these are people who say, we don't even know that we were doing anything for you. So there's certainly within Christianity a strand that would be could interpret in a very positive way the kinds of examples of non-resistant non-believers that we discussed.
Yeah, and I actually agree with you. I think there is a significant thread within Christianity to show that. But what I'm arguing is that one of the main reasons that Schellenberg appeals to that God would want a relationship with, or at least leave himself open to a relationship with persons that may choose to enter into such a relationship, is that the enormous moral benefits that would be given to that person as a result of this, right? So it seems quite plausible that if you befriend the most morally perfect person in the world, that would build up your moral fortitude. It would just make you an overall better person. And so what I'm suggesting is that, and I think what Schellenberg suggests is that that's one of the reasons why explicit, meaningful relationships, because there can be a give and take of moral facts, there can be a deeper understanding of moral facts through a kind of two-way relationship that is explicit, and that's really what the argument is saying.
Well, I would think, let's say the scenario I gave this person working with victims of war rape, were God to reveal himself in certain conditions to that person in that moment, they might take the role of the mantle of the protest atheist and reject God. So maybe for God to reestablish a relationship with that person, the best thing for him to do is to step back a while and let them relate to him in a way they are not necessarily aware of by seeking justice and mercy in the world. It still seems to me that could be a very plausible way to read that kind of data. Let me go back and give a question that's only got like 3 minutes left. So you talked about, when it came to my knockdown argument for moral intuition, I put all my eggs in that one basket. Now your response was, essentially as I understood it, you said a couple things. You said, well, we could grasp these facts by intuition. And didn't really say what that means or what process it was that gave us this as a truth-directed cognitive faculty. So I'd like you to say more about that. The other thing you did was compare it to rational intuition. Say, well, maybe it's like the rational ability to intuit certain logical axioms or something. Well, frankly, rational intuition is also, I think, a big problem for a naturalist. To say, how do you grasp a Platonic, the secret, an abstract Platonic view of realism? How do you intuit these rational facts? And Lawrence Bonjour wrote an entire book in defense of pure reason, where he's a naturalist, but he's just sort of befuddled by how you provide an account of that. So I think that just expands the mystery for you. But if you could just say more about intuition, more intuition.
So specifically, you're asking how it would be connected to moral intuition?
So what is the mechanism that you're proposing by which we acquire what I call like a moral radio that can be tuned into FM radio waves? I mean, what is it that gave us that?
Oh, I don't know. For the same reason, there's going to be mystery in any place. And so it might be that that specific fact might be, evidence for theism rather than naturalism. Yeah. I'm just saying I don't think it's as absurd as what's being painted.
I didn't say absurd, I just said mysterious. Fundamentally mysterious. And
I agree.
The point.
I agree there are a number of things on a naturalistic view that are mysterious, just as there are on all views. And then you've highlighted one, and that's an interesting question. How long have we gone?
20 seconds.
Oh, all right. 5 more questions.
So that'll probably be the end of our line of questioning, and instead we'll move into the closing statements. So would you like a moment to prepare your closing statements?
Should I just use this mic?
Yeah.
Stretch my legs? Yeah. Okay, so I knew that Justin and me, that we would agree on my second point, but I also knew there were probably people here who wouldn't. And that's why I took the time to sort of emphasize that appeal to God is a serious philosophical appeal. And there are grounds where you can appeal to a transcendent agent cause. My first argument, so what Justin sought to do to try to respond to that was to argue that for a Methodist epistemology, rather than the particularist epistemology that I proposed, and I think that you would need to do a lot more to defend the kind of methodological framework he's proposing, including explaining what percentage of the population really need to agree on this for this to count for universal sanction. If he can't do that, he might end up undermining, among other things, moral knowledge, because as I noted, at least 2% of the population does not have that kind of knowledge. So I think that there's a much better way to go at epistemological development of theories is in a particularist way. And I don't see any reason why a person such as Burton Cummings having a particular experience such as that couldn't provide rational, properly basic belief in God's existence. So then we have my third argument on moral intuition, and I didn't hear Justin provide any response to it, apart from to say that it was intuition, which is just to restate the cognitive faculty, but provide an explanation for it, to compare it to rational intuition, which I think is, if anything, even more perplexing on a naturalist account. And he also, and I've got time to address this, he also said, well, why isn't there more agreement among human beings when it comes to moral issues? Well, that's an interesting question. There is actually a fair amount of agreement. C.S. Lewis, at the end of his book, The Abolition of Man, he has a chart where he goes across culturally how cultures do agree on basic moral facts, such as honoring parents and telling the truth and so on. But I think I also know, we all know intimately that each one of us fails very much to attain to that moral status that we believe is that which makes a good person. And we all have an ability to justify our own behavior. So I think one of the reasons there is profound moral disagreement among people on some issues is from what a Christian would call human fallenness or human sinfulness. So then we had Justin presented his argument. I presented a response to the hostility of the universe. I still think that what he has done is he's brought in an assumption of anthropocentrism, that somehow this universe should be maximally safe for human beings. But that's not the issue of debate here. The issue of debate is whether God exists, not whether God created the universe to be maximally comfortable and safe for human beings. Then he had his argument, so the divine hiddenness, so why are there people who have these, want to believe in God but seem to be unable to? And I should say this, that is also a problem in the Bible. You find people in the Bible constantly struggling with God and things that God allows. And I did provide a response. I said that people, not only infants, can have a non-cognitive, meaningful relationship with God, but theism is totally open to the fact that other people have a meaningful non-cognitive relationship or non-propositional relationship with God. And I gave a scenario where a person could be related to God by pursuing justice in the world. And even noted that within Christian theology, that is one way to read the very words of Jesus. And there was one more argument. Well, I'll just leave it at that. I want to just maybe close by emphasizing this, that we are, I've got 1 minute left. We are in a period of growing opposition among people, it seems, in Western society. I tell my students, I contrast two different books. One of them was a book written by a Republican pundit who said if Democrats had any brains, they'd be Republicans. And the other one was by a Democrat who wrote a book about Republicans saying lying liars and the liars they tell. And it's an example, not only in the political discourse, but in religious discourse as well, of a lot of hostility among people, and I think it's really unfortunate. So if there's one big takeaway here, it's that Justin and me are friends, and this is an important question, and I think we've had a meaningful and illuminating dialogue.
And then we will finally allow Justin to give his closing statements before we move into a Q&A session.
I don't have anything really prepared here, but I do want to, I guess, run through a few points of some of the arguments that were raised tonight. One of them was about, again, the first argument which Randall presented, which was for the rationality of theistic belief in the absence of evidence. And he worries that I'm kind of imposing a certain kind of methodological approach, and that this has some significant problems. So I think that a better way to understand what I was doing is that I was kind of raising a reductio, right? If what Randall wants to do is say that there are certain things that are properly basic, that's fine with me. I don't have we don't part ways on the notion that there are certain beliefs that can be properly basic. Where we part ways is that I think that kind of approach should have at least some limitations. And I, in my three-pronged approach, offered up some limitations that seem to me to be perfectly reasonable. Randall has not offered limitations. I don't know if he thinks there are limitations as to what can be properly basic, but it sure seems to me like if one's view could, at least in principle, justify some, like a belief in a great pumpkin or something like that, we should be concerned, rightly so, about such a view. And so it seems like we should have some kind of limitations. And again, I don't know if Randall does that, and if this wasn't spoken about tonight, but that seems to me like something that should be of concern. And so I offered that as a reductio. Another one, his point about theism being a hypothesis. Again, I don't have any problem with that. The moral epistemology, I agree. There's issues there that need to be explored. On hiddenness, I'm forgetting what the most recent comments was on that, but it sure seems to me like if it is the case that God has created humans for relationship, it seems like the kind of relationship that God would want is the best kind, which is meaningful, conscious, explicit relationship. And why would a morally perfect being want anything other than that, as long as the persons who are the objects of that relationship were open-minded to it? So it seems like the hiddenness argument, to me, I don't think that certain appeals to what I would think of as rather trivial relationships. Yeah, they might be good things. The person working in as you said, Africa for good things, for alleviating suffering in the world. Obviously, that's good. But what I'm calling trivial is the relationship, that the sense that in which he is connected to God, even though he walks around living as an atheist. That seems to me, at best, a trivial relationship with God. It's simply connected because there's a moral aspect of his life. Hostility. Again, I worry that this anthropomorphism objection kind of misses the point. I was never arguing that the universe should be maximally hospitable to people. Rather, what I'm arguing is it shouldn't be maximally hostile to people, right? At the very least, you could have somewhere in between there. What we're seeing here is that you walk into the mudroom of the architect's house and everything else will kill you if you venture from this pale blue dot. If you don't think that that's surprising on the hypothesis that the universe was created for us, then I don't know how else to say that. Moreover, on pointless suffering, I'm forgetting the ways in which Randall addressed that, but from what I could recall, he appeals to a kind of skeptic theism. We don't know the reasons. For all we know, there are reasons that we don't know that justify the allowance of these certain instances of suffering, and that where you don't know certain facts, it kind of takes it out of context and it looks bad, but really, if you were to fully understand it, you would understand the reasons, and it would seem less egregious. And that's a popular approach taken. But in an argument such as mine, where it was a comparative argument between two hypotheses, in which argued that one of those hypotheses better explained it, then it doesn't actually serve as an objection, because all you're saying at that point is that it's possible that my hypothesis can make room for these observations, but it doesn't actually serve as a better explanation without antecedent reasons to think that those things are likely.
Okay. Thank you very much, Justin. And thank you very much to both of our debaters for what has been an illuminating and very interesting debate. So another round of applause for them, and also for all of you. We still do have some time for a question and answer period. So we have two mics set up at the sides. I think probably we can have, if you'd like to ask a question, you can rise out of your seat and come to either microphone. And I will be somewhat more strict for people from the audience asking questions. You don't get to do long expositions of where that question comes from. And can ask them to either of the debaters or both of them. So if there's anyone else with that, I'll be right there.
Test that out, Karen. Should be working.
Hello.
Yep.
I have a question about the moral intuition thing. Always my favorite topic. I'm wondering why our morals appear to have changed over time. If moral intuition, you use the word objective, they've always been there, kind of thing. If you're right, and our moral intuition has changed over time, is that because God's given it to us little by little? Or, why did He make it appear that our morals have evolved with us? I'd like to just put a preemptive on this. Please don't use murder as an example. I always get that as a rebuttal. We all know not to kill. But a long time ago in our history, we didn't know not to kill. Child sacrifice, other tribes were killed, that sort of thing. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, so maybe I'll just say a couple things here. So first of all, we always have to look at an act, but also look at the rationale that is provided for an act. So let's take one of the morally heinous actions that still occurs occasionally in the world today, and that's genocide. What is it that can lead people to think is morally permissible? And I'm talking here about the most extreme form of genocide, just mass killing. So what can justify people engaging in that kind of act Well, the thing is, if you go and ask people, what they do is they develop rationalizations to justify what they're doing. So, for example, you will adopt terminology that dehumanizes the other individuals. You will say that they're cockroaches, as happened to the Tutsis in Rwanda. You'll say that they're vermin that need to be eliminated, as happened in Nazi Germany. So I think one of the first things you have to do is look and find out, well, maybe there's actually more agreement when you peel back some of the justifications. The second thing I would say is, as I already said, people can be pretty nasty with one another. Like, that's actually pretty consistent with what Christian anthropology is. And maybe just one last thing. If we want to be in a position to say that things have gotten better over time, that people at other times and places acted in a way that was morally wrong, all things considered, then we need to maintain a commitment to our moral intuition being able to provide us with factual information to be able to say that those people were wrong. If the other alternative is to say that morality is just relative and changes with society, and I think that the consequences of that are pretty disastrous and certainly trample our moral intuitions. Thank you.
Justin, would you like to add anything?
No.
In that case, we will move on to the next question from Ian.
Hey, Randall, I had a question for you, which is that you appealed to this idea of Burton Cummings and this just bare experience that he had when he entered the church. And it seems to me that theism has a lot of content that's packed in, and there's even though lots of people have these kind of supernatural experiences, they seem to have very, very different kinds of content that varies with culture. So if it's referring to something in the world, why do you have such divergent content between these different experiences? Unlike something like vision, where we all look at a table, it's a table, we can all see it, we can all agree on things, faculty like that.
That's a great question. So, I mean, one of the first things that springs to mind is just in the last couple of weeks on the internet, this picture of a dress went viral. Did anybody see that? So,
I really hate that you brought that up.
Yeah, well, so I looked at it and I saw white and gold, and I showed it to my daughter, and she saw gray and blue or something, and I'm like, are you crazy? And the fact is that there are in other well-established forms of properly basic belief, there are some pretty big differences in the way people perceive. Now, not only that, but people also can be formed in such a way that they end up perceiving things like depth perception. They don't perceive it the same way because if they lived in the jungle all their lives, they can't perceive depth perception the same way as other people. So I think there's a lot of disagreement, actually. The other thing that you raised is, well, the example I gave was sort of a bare particular. It didn't have a lot of content to it. And that's fair enough. But minimally, all I'm saying is he can have grounds to believe there is something more out there. And it has certain properties, which were the kinds of properties that Rudolf Otto identified as a sense of holiness or otherness. And the interesting thing about the song is the title, I'm Scared. Because what people commonly sense when they have those experiences is a sense of being unworthy, a sense of fear, a sense of awe. And it seems to me that that is a minimal basis to be able to talk about properly basic belief in God.
If we are going to allow ourselves to take these experiences, oftentimes people have visions that are, again, culturally specific, then are we also, one might ask, well, are we not also allowed to take dreams as properly basic, right? So this is, again, we're running up against that problem of where can we draw the line there? Is anything fair game for properly basic belief, or do we accept that there are certain conditions, such as sleeping, that if you were to, experience, talking with your deceased grandmother or something, are you then properly justified in thinking that your grandmother really does exist in some sense, So again, I just want to narrow in on that problem. There needs to be some kind of distinction. And if we don't allow that distinction, then quite literally it seems to me very difficult to say anything other than that all possible beliefs are on the table and can be justified. as long as you believe them in a very genuine way. And that seems to me like a road that we do not want to go down, not around.
I guess we'll open it up to the next question.
I'm over here.
Oh, you went first. Okay, yeah.
I've got a question for Justin. Right at the beginning of your first presentation, you talked about atheism being a simpler point of view. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, because it seems to me that exactly the opposite is the case. As you know, science posits the existence of new things we didn't believe before, in order to explain complex things. And scientists come to believe in additional items to our ontology, because the whole picture is simpler. And it seems to me that that's the way it is with theism, where you have all of this being caused by one being with unlimited power, and one being simpler than many, and unlimited power being a simpler concept than a certain finite amount of power. And so it seems to me that theism actually gives us the simplest possible explanation of everything, the simplest possible overall picture of reality.
Sure. So again, he's talking about my first point, which was a pre-evidential point. So just comparing the two hypotheses conceptually and asking which is simpler. Well, the view of simplicity that I take is advocated by Paul Draper, and what he argues is that simplicity is determined by two things and two things only. One of those is modesty, that is the number of things that it asserts, and the number of things and the kinds of things that it asserts, and then also coherence. And coherence is just a measure of how well the parts of a hypothesis fit together. So if you have a hypothesis that asserts two things that are not really connected, it's just a shopping bag approach to hypothesis forming, where you're just going to grab into things and they don't seem to complement each other, but rather they're just made to be explanatory. That would be low in coherence, right? But if you have a theory where all the parts of it kind of flow well together and they make very much sense, it's a very cohesive whole, then that's quite different. And there's good reasons to think that that's just intrinsically more probable in a sense. And so that plus, also factoring in modesty, is the best way to think about simplicity. And so when we apply that to what I want to do is apply it to first naturalism versus supernaturalism. These two hypotheses are equal in scope. They both seem to assert kind of the same, I guess we would want to call moral properties, the mental properties. In naturalism, you have the mental properties forming from the physical properties. In supernaturalism, you have the physical properties coming from natural properties, right? So there's they're kind of mirror images of each other in a sense. Now, you take those two, and then you say, okay, well, now I want to talk about a specific version of supernaturalism, mainly one that asserts many more things about there's all knowledge, all power, all this, and that it's the ground of moral values. You're saying many more things on that particular supernaturalistic hypothesis. Meanwhile, you have naturalism over here, which is roughly equivalent to supernaturalism. It would follow then, if theism is more complex than supernaturalism, then theism is also more complex than naturalism. So that's my kind of thought there. That took too long, sorry.
Let's make a very quick point, and that's often you'll hear people say from the sort of skeptical side or atheistic side, well, I believe in everything you do, I just believe in one less God than you do. An atheist saying this. Like Richard Dawkins has said things like that, for example. So the idea seeming to be that the theist just believes in one more unnecessary thing, so that atheism is simpler. I think the fair point Jonathan makes here is that something Richard Swinburne has certainly written a lot on, is that theism can provide overall the best and simplest explanation for all the facts, including, for example, moral intuition, we just saw tonight. Theism offers a satisfactory account of that. Atheism doesn't. If you begin adding up a longer and longer list like that, and you've got the simplicity of an omnipotent being and a metaphysically simple being, which is how God has always been defining theology, pre-Christian back to ancient Greece, then that is a simple explanation for all sorts of facts. And so I agree it's a simple approach.
Just a quick point. I was talking pre-evidential. So just comparing obviously when you bring on the evidence, it's a quite different picture as to whether or not, that's another whole question to evaluate. And whether or not theism can serve as a simple explanation of things, that's something that people are going to have to decide.
Glad Randall brought up moral intuition again. You brought up moral objectivity earlier, I think, in the first question, and actually implied that moral subjectivity might be something that was disastrous for society. So clearly, you believe in moral objectivism. Is it good because God does it, or does God do it because it is good? Are things good because God does them and we should behave like God? Or are there things that are inherently good that God exemplifies?
So you're raising the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, I wasn't talking about moral ontology in this, first of all, and what I argue to say that God explains the origin of moral value or moral obligation. All I said is that God provides the best explanation for our ability to grasp moral facts. So one could, for example, and some Christians are Platonists about morality. They believe that morality exists as a transcendent good, and God exists, and God would then allow us to grasp it. So that's perfectly consistent with my case. There are other people who believe that the Euthyphro dilemma has been addressed by saying the good just is God's nature. So when we talk about the good and we talk about God, we're talking about the same thing.
And I don't know what view you take, Randall, but when it comes to the Euthyphro dilemma, as Randall said, there are theists that adopt moral Platonism. And so God at best plays an epistemic role in that. When it comes to those who think that the Euthyphro dilemma is not that big of a deal, I think that they severely underestimate it. So it might be the case that the classical Euthyphro dilemma is a false dichotomy between things being good either because God says them or God saying that things are bad because they're independently bad or good, or whatever. And so you have people like Robert Adams who are saying that, well, we can think of divine command theory as more of a theory about moral obligation, and that what grounds the goodness of what might be good is the very nature of God. The problem there is then you could ask a question roughly similar to Euthyphro and ask something to the effect of, well, are the properties that are of God, are those good properties because they're found in God, or does God have those properties because they are good independently? And that seems to me like, at best, or at worst, I guess, an equally difficult problem. And it doesn't seem like that can fall away to a false dichotomy as people like William Lane Craig or Robert Adams would want to impose. And plus, Robert Adams is also a moral Platonist in some sense. He thinks that there are at least some moral facts that are not tied to God.
We only have this room until 6.
Well, I don't mind staying a little bit later as long as you guys are okay with that.
What about doing it in photo?
Pardon?
I'm sure that you two will still be here for a little bit. Sure.
Let's take one more question, I guess, and then...
Yeah, since you did stand, we do one more question, but short question, short answer.
Sure. So it's for Justin. It's regarding your hostility argument, the university hostile. I find it very curious. So in your concluding arguments, it sounded to me like the concluding appeal was to surprise, the element of surprise. If you're not surprised by this, I don't know what else to say. It's, I think, a paraphrase of what I got from you saying.
Sure.
So to me, that sounds a little bit reminiscent of the intelligent design theorist's argument that if you're not surprised at this capacity to create complexity is coming out of random mutations, etc., if that doesn't surprise you as being unrealistic, then it sounds parallel to the intelligent design theorist. And what I'd like to know is,
It's also parallel to the fine-tuning argument that Thea sees. And the fine-tuning argument is precise and quantitative. So do you have, can we squeeze the hostility argument a little more beyond surprise and look for quantitative aspects to it?
I guess I'm not entirely sure what you mean. When I'm talking about, so recall that what I was doing was comparing two hypotheses as to their simplicity and their relative explanatory scope. And so when I say that something is surprising on a hypothesis, I'm saying it has very little explanatory resources to make sense of this observation. And this is a common argument tactic, so it shouldn't surprise anyone that people like the intelligent design movement who want to forward arguments about what we observe in the world would say that on naturalism, this particular biochemical mechanism is very surprising, right? That's just a general explanatory kind of argument. And so, yeah, it's going to parallel a lot of explanatory arguments in that way. And yeah, so the fine-tuning arguments, certain fine-tuning arguments, I mean, it's Collins.
They give numbers. Can you give numbers for how hostile the university is will be expected?
Oh, I don't think numbers are necessary. I think what you can do is say the degree of surprise, right? It's going to be relatively imprecise, as things are. They tend to be, right? The world is imprecise and messy. So you say, well, given the conceptual content of this hypothesis, how likely is it to yield this fact that we observe? And if this fact is really awkward and obscure given that hypothesis, then we can say that it's very surprising. If there's another hypothesis over here that practically yields this out of necessity, then we can say, well, this has much stronger explanatory power than this one does, and so that fact would serve as evidence for this one over here. So it's a matter of yielding expectations and comparing those to what we see in the world, just a kind of basic hypothesis testing and how we do that. So,
thank you for your question. And if there are no other big questions.
Well, I had a question. Do I get to ask it just because I'm the boss?
You are the boss.
I promise one more, and then we can informally ask questions later and then take care of some more housekeeping before we all leave. I want to direct my question to Randall, but I wouldn't mind if Justin has some thoughts following up. So Randall, when you're arguing that Justin is inserting some anthropocentrism into his idea that we might expect this earth we live on to not be hostile to our life, okay? You seem to me, at least to me, be changing the topic to deism and away from a theism, away from what's, I think, classically defined as a caring God. And by at least my definition, I might be misinformed, a deistic God could very well exist, but he just might not care if our planet is hostile to life or welcoming to life. And so why is the well-being of creation not a concern necessarily for the theism you're advocating, and why is that not then simply a form of deism?
Okay, so two things is how to define deism.
Right.
Deism is a belief, a movement about God that arose in the 17th century. It wasn't that God didn't care about creation. According to deists, the idea was God doesn't intervene in creation simply because to intervene is unnecessary. He sets up creation to work like a sort of clockwork, and the way that we can know about God is by following the moral law and the dictates of conscience. So deism doesn't deny divine intervention, but it doesn't say God's uncaring. The argument I presented just underdetermines the question of deism or another type of theism. It just argues that we've got grounds to believe that there's a God out there. So it would be consistent with deism, but also would be consistent with Christian theism. Now, in terms of anthropocentrism, so what anthropocentrism is God says, no, this is all for you. But then you kind of move away from anthropocentrism to say God doesn't care, to the denial of it. And to deny anthropocentrism isn't to say that God doesn't care, it's just to say that we're one of the many things God created and cares about, but we're not necessarily the center of the universe.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate my point of it might be that there are more things than just humans that God cares about, but that in itself doesn't explain the hostility of the environment in which he's put us. So that's my primary worry for that evidential point.
Just quickly, so let's say in 10,000 years from now, human beings had developed technology, they're traveling in wormholes across the universe, they're terraforming planets, they're making the universe more and more hospitable. That would seem one reason that God might create a hostile universe is precisely to give us the task of making it hospitable. If you don't know that that's a possibility, then it seems that you simply are overreading the evidence in support of your views.
Gosh, can I say one more thing? I feel like Okay, so I'll just say one more point here. So there's this point about God would appreciate and would encourage this kind of intellectual investigation, but of course when we look at the sciences, the projects that are tasked with understanding our world, if we look at the populations of those are by and large secular-minded individuals. And God would have known that prior to creating the intelligible universe to explore it, right? So it seems to me like at best science works as a distraction from relationship with God. And so it seems to me like an intelligible universe which encourages people to focus on learning about the world rather than learning about a deep relationship with God, it seems to me like that's rather unlikely on theism. It seems to be a big distraction on theism for God's creative features. It's like a parent giving a child a way cooler toy and then them playing with that all day and forgetting about the creator, right?
But Johann Kepler in the 1700s said, "My God, I'm thinking my thoughts after me," because he was studying planetary.
Right, but there's also no need for that hypothesis.
Touche.
Okay, well. Okay.
So, thank you very much. Yeah, in that case, I will turn over to Alex to do the last little bit of housekeeping to advertise for the Taylor Seminary discussion tomorrow. Give this line.
Let's do that. There it is. And Robbie doesn't know this, so I'm giving him a free pass. If you call me Alex instead of Alexander, I will not be happy. Okay? I'm just kidding. So this is happening tomorrow night. This is part 2 of this discussion. And if you were enjoying just the back and forth as much as I was, you're going to want to come to this. So this is at Taylor Seminary. This is where Randall teaches during the day when he has, obviously everything's to do and just come here for fun. So this is happening tomorrow. It's going to be, as far as I know, a sort of overstuffed couch affair. It's going to be really fun, really, how do you say it? We're going to have a lot of interpenetration of ideas rather than just stating it. So I encourage you to come out. A few other things. The UAAA is hosting on March 20th a panel here at the university on the question of what does it mean to be secular? And that's going to be happening again on March 20th. I encourage you to look us up on Facebook or add yourself to the mailing list outside, because that way you can become aware of that. As of right now, Student Group Services has promised to give me a room on Monday, and so we'll have to find out about the exact location for that later. We also have our AGM at the end of March, as every student group has to do. And so if you'd like to vote on what we do as a group, the University of Alberta Atheists and Agnostics, I'd encourage you to come on out. And if you want to become more involved in the club and in activities like these on a secular campus, I would also encourage you to come out if that's what you're interested in. Can we thank everyone again for another great debate? We're going to walk over to the room at the top bar in the Student Union building. That's on the 7th floor of the SU. And you're all formally invited to hang out with us there and engage in conversation once we clear out. We're going to take it by storm. All right.
Hey, nice job. Oh, yeah.